Hello, everybody. Welcome and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're from. Great to see so many of you in the room here today. It's the second day of the annual meeting of the Global Future Councils, deep in discussion mode, and hopefully we'll get to hear a little bit about what's been happening over the past day and a half. This session wraps up almost all of the thinking around the council, so not to put too much pressure on our panel here, but what we were trying to find here is, if this is an annual meeting with Global Future Councils, and we've got three of the greatest minds here planning and helping us prepare for the future, are we going to go away from this this meeting with a clearer idea, a path to making sure that, as Lee Howell, our managing board member, said in a previous session, that we can be inspired by the future and not afraid of it and not scared or surprised by it. This is broadcast live on Facebook Live and on weforum.org, so we're going to start by encouraging you all to participate in a poll. Are we prepared for the future? That's hashtag yes or hashtag no. Two answers. Choose the one you think, and we can take a poll throughout the running of the conference, see how our panel do, if they're helping you prepare or they're helping you feel less uncertain. Enough of me talking. I'm going to introduce my panel. To my immediate left, Victoria Espinel. Great to see you again. Victoria is co-chair of the Digital Society and Economy panel in her day job. She is the president and chief executive of BSA, the Software Alliance. Victoria and I first got to know each other 2 years ago when her council released a really interesting study on technology tipping points. It's quite a couple of those are my favorites. Traffic light-free cities by 2025, I think, and robots in the boardroom by, I'm not quite sure when. Yeah, maybe already. Maybe we don't even know about them. Maybe we've already got robots in the boardroom. Stephane Kasriel is the chief executive officer of Upwork, which is a platform for getting people into work. Not a startup, not a new company, been around for a long time, but collaborating with us a lot on our Future of Jobs work and the system initiative around employment and skills. Andrew Maynard, Professor, School of the Future of Innovation in Society, Arizona State University. Andy, I unfairly regard you as a bit of a doomsday merchant because you contribute to the Global Risks Report. So Andy's the one who normally says, those global risks, they're going to get a lot worse. So I'm going to ask you to be optimistic in this session. Okay. If you like. We'll see. Feel free to disagree with each other. We want to keep this as flowing as possible. Feel free to ask questions. Victoria, let's start with you. How have you helped us prepare for the future at this meeting?
Well, you said, are people surprised or are they scared? And I think that's a really important component of this, because I think fear can come from a lack of understanding or feeling like you're going to be surprised. And that's one of the reasons I feel like conversations like the ones that we're having here at the World Economic Forum are so important. I think if there's a better understanding of what the future holds, it is much less likely that people will be surprised and therefore fearful of what happens. So I think part of it is preparedness, but in order to prepare, you have to understand. And I think that's the purpose of the report that we put out, the technological tipping points that you referred to, and also I think an important component of what we're hopefully doing here. And to your question, in fact, yes, there is already one company that has an AI on their board of directors. So that is a tipping point that has already happened.
Already happened, ahead of schedule. Stephane, one of the big fears, and there's no surprise why, and it's perfectly understandable, is that the future is going to be a future where we work less and probably get paid less. It's not the utopian dream of plenty of leisure time, but there's very real fears out there with displacement of work and not enough skills to do the jobs that are coming available. What's your assessment?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of fear, and I would say the recent Brexit in the UK and the election in the US are probably an indication of how much fear there is. I think the work we're trying to do here within the forum, and in particular within the Global Future Council on the Future of Work, is really helping guide us towards this transition phase and making sure that the future is not, all doom and gloom, but that we keep giving meaningful jobs to people throughout the world in a world that is changing. People talk about robotics, people talk about AI, people talk about the acceleration of the change of pace in skills. People talk about the fact that, the African continent is going to have 1 billion more people by 2040, and we need to find jobs for 1 billion more people. So there's definitely a lot of challenges out there. I would say at the very high level, though, the world is not running out of problems to solve. And until we run out of problems to solve, provided that we have educated people that are skilled at solving problems, we'll continue to have jobs for people.
And Andy as well, you're an expert on risk. What aspects of the fourth industrial revolution do we understand the least?
Oh, goodness me, an awful lot of it. So what we do know is that every other previous industrial revolution, we've had major problems that have been caused, and we've spent the next decade, sometimes centuries, trying to fix them. And the same is going to happen again. That's inevitable. There are going to be downsides to where we're going with technology innovation. The big problem, though, is we really don't understand the pace of things. In the past, we've had time to adjust to the new world with tech innovation. This time, we have so many innovations coming so fast that as a society, we're struggling to keep up and understanding how to reduce the risks. So one of the big challenges we face is going ahead so fast that we end up with very, very complex systems that can fail because we don't understand the nature of those systems. And one of the challenges and one of the opportunities we have is predicting how those systems are going to develop and channeling them in certain ways so we actually see the benefits while avoiding some of the worst risks.
We've got our first comment, and it's from Ryan Bailey. Perfect fusion and make oil irrelevant. I thought that was an advert, actually. Perfect Fusion. It's a great brand. Perfect Fusion and make oil irrelevant. Is that realistic?
No.
Okay. So far so pessimistic. All right. Will the future be better or worse, everybody? Hashtag yes or hashtag no. Look, we talk about Professor Schwab mentioned in his presentation this morning. Four big factors facing the world. We're moving from unipolar to multipolar. We've got slow growth. We've got disaffection and loss of identity. And we've got the fourth industrial revolution on top of all that. Surely it's making things even more complicated, Victoria.
Well, I think it's not just making things more complicated. I think in some cases it's one of the root factors. So, the fourth industrial revolution, I think, is clearly just at the beginning. We've talked about the pace of rapid change, and I think if you look at what's happening in the technology space, I mean, if you look just at big data and data analytics and what that's doing in terms of healthcare and agriculture and business efficiency, and then you layer on top of that changes coming in the blockchain, changes in quantum, which I think are a little bit far off in the future, but not that far off in the future. It's a change that is so quick in technology that I think, going to Andrew's point, it's very hard to predict exactly what the societal impacts will be to that. So I think we can see some of them happening, like shifts in the labor markets. We can see risks happening in cybersecurity. We can see opportunities that are happening in terms of healthcare advantages. But I think how you put all that together and how governments get ready to be able to serve their citizens in that context is one of the big open questions that we need to figure out. And certainly my group, Digital Economy and Society, that's one of the things that we've been talking about, looking at all the challenges and the opportunities, and then what can governments and businesses be doing together to try to mitigate any risk from that and maximize the benefits.
Sure. Because, Stephane, the risks of society becoming even more further driven apart internationally between nations, but also within nations, is real. And technology should be bringing people together, but actually it's driving people apart.
I mean, I think like in any challenge like this, you should also be trying to look for opportunities and trying to be more solution-oriented. So let me give you an example of where technology already helps and will continue to help in the future. If you look at GDP in the world in the last 100 years has become more concentrated in a smaller number of cities, right? And talent hasn't, right? So the number of great universities in the world is much more distributed than the number of cities where there are meaningful jobs. The cost of living in those cities, think Shanghai, think New York, think San Francisco, London. Cost of living is going up faster than wages in many of them. San Francisco is, relatively speaking, 8 times more expensive today than it was in 1986, right? College students who graduate spend almost 70% of their after-tax income on rent. This is not healthy. This idea that most of the world is going to be empty and jobless, even though people would be really talented there, and then there's a very small number of cities that are highly congested and extremely expensive to live in, not exactly desirable, right? But you're seeing that trend starting to change. You're starting to see people that are moving back to their local communities, freelancing, working online, and that is, one of the things that technology can enable. And so I think, the doom and gloom should be a source of urgency for us. We should look at it as saying, we need to make changes, and we need to make changes to our education system. We need to make changes to social policies, but we shouldn't look at it as, therefore, we're done with as a human race and robots are taking over, because that's really unhelpful.
Tipping point for robots taking over, Victoria. Did you do that one? Maybe that's the follow-up report. Just a reminder to you guys watching at home, we're in a room here which is slightly echoey, so we don't have the tie mics that we do in the booths, so you might want to wear headphones, just to put that one out there. So will the future be better or worse? Hashtag yes or hashtag no. Chris Moody has just come in with a question, and keep those questions coming. I like it because it's not very future prepared at all. It's an old school suggestion. Training programs for apprentice applicants. Mm-hmm. You know, my father was an apprentice. Generations before were apprentices, and yet we're not doing it enough. So do we need to actually look to the past for a bit of our future? Stephane, I guess this is one for you. It's the work question. Yeah, so
one of the topics in our Global Future Council is the future of education. And, so if you think about education, there's multiple phases in it, right? There's early childhood, which is something that in many countries is under studied today, but we know that the vast majority of the brain of a child is developed by the age of 9. We also know that there are vast differences in terms of the amount of learning that happens in different countries and even within a country in different communities, and that needs to get improved. There's a lot of work that has been done on K through 12 education, but if you have to summarize it, people that are within K through 12 are learning things, are going to have jobs when they graduate that don't exist when they are going through K through 12. So the idea that you need to learn very specific skills to prepare for the workforce is no longer relevant. What you really need to learn is to learn how to learn. You need to learn character. You need to learn integrity. You need to learn agility. You don't need to learn, specific coding skills. After that, historically in many countries, and Germany might be one of the outliers, we focused a lot on the 4-year college degree and given up a little bit too much on vocational training, and I think that's the source of this question. In many countries, vocational training is considered a second-class citizen, and yet it's highly valuable. Plumbers are not going away. As an example, there's a shortage of electricians in many countries in the world, partly because society has put this type of education lower than the 4-year degree, even though potentially it's more needed by society. And I think the last piece that we've been discussing a lot is a huge increased need in lifelong learning. Today, we still live in the mentality that you study until the age of 20 to 25, and then you'll get some amount of training on the job as you go, but essentially, we hope that all of your learning is good enough for the rest of your career. And as skills keep changing and the pace of it keeps accelerating, that notion needs to be changed. And we really need to get to a world where jobs are getting shorter and shorter, and degrees also need to be shorter and interspaced with jobs. This notion of the micro degree, where every 2 to 3 years, as you switch jobs, you also learn a new skill so that you can get yourself prepared for the next phase of your career.
Fascinating, and I did met a couple of ladies from the Robotics Council yesterday, and it was all about talking and training and teaching robots to be empathetic, and we hear so much about coding, don't we, in terms of getting kids coding, but it's the human side as well. Would you agree, Victoria?
Well, one thing, though, I would say, just to pick on what you said, I think it is important, though, that we're teaching more coding in schools. Certainly in the United States, I think it's important. I think it's important in other markets as well. So I take your point, or what I would say you probably meant by that is, the point of that is not to teach a particular coding language, because we know 15 years from now that coding language is going to be relevant. But I think teaching that skill is very important. If nothing else, it teaches a form of linear decision making that is very useful and applicable to other things. But I would make a plug for more computer science education and more coding, both in the United States and around the world.
Yeah, I completely agree, right? I mean, there's 600,000 open jobs in the US that require a computer science degree, and we only train about 50,000 computer scientists per year. So I was not trying to say no computer science. The point was, it's really about...
I was driving a wedge between you. And it was a totally cynical ploy. We're on the same page.
I represent an industry that has more jobs than it can fill, and that is something. And I would also make a plug for the fact that we need to get we need to have more diversity in coding. I think if there are more girls coding, I think our software will be more innovative. I think it'll be more creative. I think it'll be more secure. So I think it's very important to be building that pipeline, but building that pipeline with more girls and with more representatives of underrepresented communities. The last thing I'll say on this is our society is so impacted by the changes that are driven by software, so it's essential that when that software is being designed, there is a broad representation at the table because of the impact that it has on society.
We're going to stick with labour and skills for a bit, and Andy, I want to bring in some of your wider experience. Miho Hanna has just sent in a question from the West Coast. Bay Area resident, working in the service industry on a long road to a living wage, when the only way to create skilled labour is to provide livable apprenticeship, why does it remain such a low priority from a business perspective to give any kind of reasonable growth to people willing to give their time to vocational training?
Really good question. And the answer is we've got to have culture change. We've got to have culture change both in expectations of individuals within society and within employers within society. So actually, you put this back in a risk perspective. What we risk here is something that's important both to people that are trying to build a career, they want a career and they can't do it, but also to those businesses that need trained people. So when you begin to look at this in a risk perspective, we can begin to work out how to mitigate that risk by opening up opportunities, changing the culture, and getting businesses to realize that they have an investment opportunity here to actually grow a workforce which is going to be beneficial to them and beneficial to the people they employ. But it's going to take a change in mentality.
Okay, let's remind people of the poll. We have a poll here. Will the future be better or worse? So that's hashtag yes for better, hashtag no. And Andy, sticking with you, because you have a broad kind of palette of expertise when it comes to risks. Give us a couple of areas where you would like leaders to prioritize. Leaders in government, leaders in business, it doesn't need to matter, but what are the key amongst this whole multitude of risks in your landscape? Sure.
So actually the thing that concerns me most is the convergence between different streams of technology innovation. So we're already seeing that with the fourth industrial revolution, where the digital world is beginning to merge with the physical world. And what we're finding from that is it's not only very hard to predict where opportunities and risks arise, but it's very hard to plan for how you're going to manage them. So the biggest challenge to leaders, whether they're in the public sector or private sector, is developing those tools where they can both get some idea of where technology innovation and its impacts and its opportunities are going, but also develop the agility to respond very rapidly to a changing landscape. For example, if you look at the way we regulate things at the moment, our regulations are very inflexible, which means that if you've got a changing world that changes over the period of a number of years, or even a number of months, we can't keep those regulations up with that pace, which means that we have huge vulnerabilities. So a big challenge there is changing the way we regulate to take advantage of new technologies and prevent bad pathways or prevent us from following bad pathways when it becomes very apparent that something is failing very fast.
We hear this a lot about the failure of regulation to keep up, but what do we do about it? Because this has been going on for so long. You need to regulate, right? You need regulators.
So you do, but you need to think about it in a different way. So government regulation is really the last resort in many cases, but also we've got to have regulation which is agile. And we're beginning to find ways of thinking differently about regulation where we can do that. So developing frameworks where you can have very strong innovation which goes along pathways which is going to be more beneficial rather than detrimental. But we've got to implement that across a lot of different domains. At the moment, we're only seeing it in one or two very small areas.
Victoria.
So I absolutely agree with that. I think we need to move to an era of agile governance. My former group here at WEF has actually been working on a set of agile principles for governance, and they focus on things like making sure that government is more inclusive. They are drawn from sort of Silicon Valley mindset of agile software development, but they're focused on things like making government more participatory, making sure that every voice is heard, making sure that government is flexible enough and self-critical enough that it is built into government, that they are revisiting decisions and programs and improving them and rejecting those that are not working, and making sure that government is data-driven as it can be. So sort of looking at evolution over process, looking at goals and outcomes over prescriptive rules, looking at collaboration among different parts of governments. I think there's a lot that government could learn from a tech mindset in terms of how to be more agile. You know, my background is in public policy, so I'm keenly aware of the fact that governing is very, very different than software development, but I think there is a lot that can be learned from a collaborative, iterative mindset, and I think it's absolutely critical that we move to an era of agile governance.
Andy, you said there are a couple of areas where it's happening. Who are the outliers?
So, for instance, if you look very recently at what the US has done with policy around autonomous vehicles and self-driving vehicles, they've actually developed policies that create a framework which nudge developers into a direction where they can actually develop socially responsive but also highly beneficial technologies. So instead of telling them that they can't do something, they've told them, try and reach these goals, and it's up to you how you actually reach those goals. So that's a very anticipatory, very agile form of governance rather than a restrictive form of governance.
I'd love to have some questions from the floor. I think there's a gentleman here. Also, we're in a very future-focused city here. Dubai, we just had the Minister for the Future. I don't know many other countries that have a Minister for the Future, and announced six separate policy initiatives which would help, in his view and his ministry's view, prepare the country for the future. So I would love to hear some questions from those folks living and working in the UAE or the this Gulf region. Gentleman here on the third row.
Yeah, my name is Kjell Louis. I'm from Morgenavisen in Denmark, and I would like to ask a question in relation to what you've been talking about. If there is fear and lack due to lack of knowledge about the developments, and politicians are part of those with lack of knowledge and therefore fearful, as a recent election may suggest, how do you envisage training politicians to understand this? Because I was at a session in 3D printing, and one of the things mentioned was that very few politicians nowadays have a background in manufacturing, so they don't understand basically what's going on. And politicians not knowing what's going on tend to be prone to lobbyists and other kind of influences. So how do you envisage training them to be on top of this development?
I'll give the floor to you, and then I'll say a word on that.
Okay. So I think a couple of really important points here. It's very hard to make decisions in society, whether you're looking at leaders or whether you're looking at citizens, if you don't have information. So it's absolutely critical that we've got to have information readily available, readily accessible on the implications of where new technologies are going. And I think it's important to distinguish between the implications versus the technical knowledge. Secondly, we have to be very aware that decisions are made on a whole range of factors. It's not just knowledge about the technologies. And sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking if only everybody knew about the technologies, everything would be great. That's very naive, but it's also very misleading. So we've got to understand the broader social context there as well.
I'll just say I think the accessibility of that information is key. So I don't think politicians or policymakers need to understand exactly how the technology works. I think that would probably be a poor use of their time. But I think understanding what the social implications are, since their job is to deliver services to citizens as best they can, understanding how society is changing and what impact the technologies are going to be driving so they can be thinking about the best public policy responses to them are key. And the question is how to do that in a way that is accessible and compelling and credible to politicians and policymakers who are not living their life in Silicon Valley, are not immersed in technology. And that's a real challenge, filling that educational gap.
Thanks. Andy, you've got one more comment to that one, and then I'll bring in one of our members of our audience.
I have. Just really quickly, something that is vital here is independent information. If you have information which is hyping a technology, and we have an awful lot of this, again, it's very hard to make informed decisions.
We're staying on this tack, actually. Alexandra Olaya Castro, good question, thank you. What kind of technology will encourage flexibility of governments? Can you code a better government? Robots in the cabinet.
I think it's more of a mindset than a technology. Look, I think there's some places where technology can be specific, can be helpful to government. I'll mention a few. I think having more data-driven government and having, But really, that also goes to the mindset. You have to have a government who's willing to try different policies, actually test them against measurable outcomes, and then have the political will to make decisions about programs based on the actual results of those. So technology can help governments do that, but only if first they have decided as a mindset that that's something that they're willing to do. I think, we talked about information. Getting information into government in a way that they can absorb is a really important problem that we need to figure out. And I think there may be some ways that technology can help solve that, which would increase civic participation and inclusion and would be very important. But I think the technology tools are absolutely critical, but the first thing is the mindset.
I would say it's the same tools that large corporations use to accelerate their innovation, right? I mean, it's switching to a more agile mindset, training your workforce, in this case, government employees and officials to act differently, and then bringing in external talent and specialists on an as-needed basis to make data-driven decisions that are non-partisan and are actually objective.
Maybe we should talk about whether it's the human beings that are prepared for the future, because the machinery and the technology inevitably is. Stephane, you're a platform. Upwork is a platform. That kind of platform technology, does that have a role in government and helping governments prepare?
Yeah, I mean, I think, at the end of the day, what a lot of the platforms are trying to do is to make the world more efficient than it is today, right? I mean, if you think about the job market today, you hear on one side workers saying, well, it's really, really hard to find a job, and on the other side you see CEOs and company executives saying it's really, really hard to find talent. And a big part of this comes from incredibly antiquated and inefficient matching systems between employers and employees. If you think about how we apply for jobs today, it really hasn't changed in 100 years. You used to do this through newspaper ads and snail mailing a cover letter, but nowadays you still kind of do the same thing. You submit your resume through an online form, and people go through piles of resumes in order to interview each other. The whole model is fairly broken as it is today. And so you add to that the lack of awareness of data. Workers don't necessarily even know what employers are looking for, and employers don't necessarily give the data back to the education system so that it can improve the training for the next generation of workers. And then you add on top of that a geographic dimension of this, which is the fact that, as I said before, the place where the jobs are is not necessarily the place where the best qualified candidates are. So you add these three things together and you realize why the world of work is so inefficient today. And platform technologies can fix all of these issues and then some.
I've just realized we've got out of time. That's the trouble when you're enjoying yourself so much. But I don't want to leave it just yet. If I can bear with me for a couple more minutes. I want to ask you two more questions. One is, what is going to be your key priority going away from this meeting? What do you want your council to do? You may have touched upon it, but but let's frame that again one more time. And you've had time now to meet other councils. This morning was about cross-cutting and getting to know the rest of the network. So I'd like you to tell us, apart from your own council, which council would you like to be on most? Okay. So let's start with you, Andy, because you're furthest away.
Oh, goodness me, that's putting me on the spot. So let me just say I actually started my life as a physicist. So I, despite the fact that I talk about risk and I talk about policy and regulation, I'm really a geek. So I would love to be on one of the tech councils. Let's just choose artificial intelligence and robotics, seeing that that's where some really interesting stuff's happening.
Everybody loves that council.
I know,
Everybody loves that council. And in case you haven't already told us, what do you want to go away, and what's your kind of key priority for your council?
So I think one of the big takeaways to me is the understanding that technology isn't or shouldn't be something that just happens to people, but it's something that everybody should be a part of designing for the future.
Stephane.
So let me start by answering the question of what are the key takeaways. I mean, for me, I think probably the two things that our future council can work on. One is helping with this independent information. There's a lot of data out there that actually demonstrate that the future is not nearly as bleak as what a lot of people seem to be believing right now. So I think that just exposing that will be extremely helpful. That being said, I still think we need to create a sense of urgency. Changes need to happen, and being very clear on what are the top 4 or 5 things that different stakeholders, private and public, should be working on is fairly critical. To answer the question about what is my favorite GFC, I'm also completely a geek and a nerd, and I'm fascinated by the blockchain technology. So if I had to go do something, I would go work on that.
I sit in a group at the forum that decides and reviews all the projects, and every single industry is looking at blockchain across our institution. Anything from smallholder farming to real estate to obviously banking. It's again another popular one. Okay, Victoria, over to you.
So my group has an intense 3 hours together after I get out of this, and what we're hoping to come away with this is a vision of what the digital economy and society should look like optimally, and then what we hope to do is work with the World Economic Forum to get a number of governments, companies, NGOs, sort of various participants in the multi-stakeholder process to sign on to that vision, and then additionally to make some actual commitments to drive it forward. So that's what I'm hoping that we leave here with. In terms of the councils, that's very difficult, and I got to go last, so I'm going to pick two. I think there's a council.
There are lots of other good councils, not just two good councils.
There's a council on technology and values. I may be getting the name of it wrong.
It's a good one.
But I think that's an incredibly important issue. And then I would also say blockchain. If I was going to pick one in the fourth industrial revolution enablers, I think the group on blockchain is having some interesting discussions.
Okay, well, we've got to get in that council area. Technology, values, and policy, but it sounds really dry, but it's actually so important. It's at the baseline of almost all of it.
I don't think it sounds dry at all. I think it sounds fascinating.
Yeah, well, no, but as soon as you look into it, maybe I'm just, somebody who is not very deep on these matters. But talking to the people in that council, they're doing a lot of good work. Can I keep you for one more question? This gentleman here in the front row.
So I enjoyed the discussion, and I think it's great that the WEF is talking a bit more about human beings and about, how people can train themselves for jobs and how they can adapt to the new economy. I worked in government in Jordan for 2 years, and then I ran a startup here in the Middle East for 2 years. And in February, I went to Silicon Valley in Palo Alto at Google Startup Grind. And, my background had been in the Middle East, my experience had been in Jordan. And I remember walking into the event, and you had kind of a placard of Richard Branson and a placard of Tesla and, Bill Gates, and everyone was taking photos next to these, big capitalists, which in Europe, in London, is possibly something we might not do. And then we walked into the conference, and we had, I think, William Draper give a talk about how to make money, how all these new technologies were coming out, and about how it was going to change the economy, and about how, we would become the next billionaires, and how that was great. And in a way, coming from the Middle East, where we've got 65 million people displaced, and we have fundamental economic problems back home, I thought it was really interesting. I'm happy with making money. I think most of my generation are. But there's also that point, can't technology do a bit more? Can't our governments do a bit more? And I think the other aspect of that was, I've been reading a lot of Bertrand Russell, and he writes that during industrial revolutions, any industrial revolution, really the power goes to those that have the capital. So if you have the capital to build a train line, or an artificial intelligence, or a driverless car, during that period of transition, you're really the one who's controlling the workers, because until that technology manifests and scales, you need to have the capital to support it. And that, he argues, changes government and it changes society as a whole. So the WEF has been talking a lot about, how can people adapt? How can we help them adapt to all these changes that are going on? And I think that's amazing and surprising in a way, and it's good. But surely the bigger question, and the much more profound and interesting question is, if technology is changing so fundamentally, if our world itself and history is changing, how can government and society itself and culture really grapple and create a system that works for everyone and can accommodate these changes, so we don't have to go through the truly difficult phases that we went through in the last industrial revolutions?
Yeah. It's not financial capital, it's intellectual capital, of course, but
yeah.
the owners of capital are well placed. Andy, this is something which we all are kept up at night.
It is, and this is where I actually have the privilege of being on the Council for Technology, Values and Policy. And this is fundamental, and one of the things we're talking about is how do you embed values into the process of technology innovation, so that it's not just about getting the latest gizmo to market, making as much money as possible, but there's actually social responsiveness and social responsibility there. And I think if you look at where things are going with the fourth industrial revolution, both there's a tremendous opportunity there to do things differently, and I think we've got to think critically about that. But also there's a tremendous opportunity to get things wrong if we don't think about that, simply because things, again, are moving so fast that we become very vulnerable to losing society because of the short-term financial gains that we see. So we've got to really change our mindset in terms of how we think about almost that social contract between the innovators and the investors and what society actually gets out of that.
Thanks very much. Well, I've taken you from lunch, I've just realized, and then you have 3 hours of hard labor ahead of you as well, and there's no AI or anything can replace your brain power quite yet, so we need you working fit. So we're going to have to finish this session now. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us here in the room. Thank you for joining us live online, Facebook, weforum.org. This session is now finished.
Thank you.